Even by Israeli standards, this week stands out. Netanyahu's top advisors arrested in the Qatar Gate affair. The prime minister himself questioned while scrambling to appoint a new Shin Bet director in spite of the court blocking him. Israel expanding its war in Gaza while 59 hostages are still being held there. And we search for some answers in our Jewish past with lawyer, writer, and scholar Anthony Julius, because obviously the present is a very big question mark. It's Unholy. I'm Yonit Levy in Tel Aviv. Unholy, two Jews on the news. Jonathan is away, and I needed someone to help me make sense of everything, or at least sit with me on a metaphorical couch together and be bewildered. So I asked my dear friend Matti Friedman to talk to me today. Hi, Matti.
Hi, Yonit.
Best-selling author and writer for the Free Press in Jerusalem. There's a huge gap between us, we should tell our listeners, because you're a Jerusalemite and I'm a Tel Avivian, and that comes with a lot of differences, but we'll try and bridge over them because there's so much to say this week. But beyond everything, I mean, we should also say, I think, mention that you are originally from Canada, which means you come with a 25% tariff this morning, and I come only with a 17% taraff.
Canadian's not quite as good as a Brit, but I try to keep the cultural level high.
I mean, yesterday I just have to, before we dive into the Israeli quagmire, I'll voluntarily dive into it. I'm just thinking about that. The whole world turning upside down with Trump's new tariffs. And the Israelis actually quite uncharacteristically tried to preempt this with a move by Bezalel Smotrich declaring the fact that Israel is actually canceling all tariffs on imports from the U.S. Obviously, that didn't help us much. But I feel like, generally speaking, and maybe this is a prelude to our conversation, the world kind of feels like this place where you're on a school bus, but where's the driver, right? Like the grown-ups have abdicated their authority, and now you're sort of alone.
It does feel like that. And to be in a country like Israel with that feeling is, I think, more frightening than being in a country like the United States or Canada with that feeling, because this, it's not a bus, like a modern bus driving on a highway, a straight highway in North America. This is more like one of those buses, if you've been to Nepal, kind of teetering on a 2-yard wide strip of dirt on the side of a mountain. And to be here without responsible adults in charge is quite distressing.
Yeah, I mean, you wrote that. I think that's your final paragraph in your piece about what happened in Israel today, this week, which is really, for lack of a better word, bananas. We'll go into it in a moment. But you wrote that Israel can't afford these mistakes, right, or these sort of curves in the road that it's taking so abruptly. But let's go into what happened this week. Do we want to run through, everything that we kind of experienced throughout this week?
You said that we have 7 or 8 hours for this episode, so I think we should definitely dive in. 7 or 8 hours should take us, I think, until Monday at about lunchtime. It's quite unprecedented, even by Israeli standards, and I think like that, like the famous frog in the pot of water, the temperature of which increases until it's boiling. I think we're kind of like that in that we've become used over a period of years to just a level of political vitriol and accusation that have deadened our senses. And one of your colleagues, Yair Sherki, put it beautifully the other day. Imagine a foreign ambassador reporting back to his government about the goings-on in Israel. The ruling party, that's Likud, put out a statement that the Secret Service, the Shin Bet, is conducting a coup by using arrest warrants. The prime minister announced a new Shin Bet director in the morning on Monday, then retracted it in the afternoon because his base said no. The suspicions facing the people in Netanyahu's orbit are that with Israel at war with Hamas, they worked for the state that funded Hamas. You have to translate this into English, he said, to get a moment of perspective on what's going on and to understand the level of insanity of what we're experiencing. That's not the way Yair usually speaks. It's not the way an Israeli journalist usually speaks. We're all quite used to insanity. And for an Israeli to say that on Channel 12, on your station, is really an indication of how crazy this is, even by our own standards.
So let's try and sort of just break down what we experienced. It kind of concentrates on Monday morning or till midday. First of all, we should say Netanyahu's top advisors, arrested in the Qatar Gate affair. Generally, the allegation is that they accepted money from Qatar while working for the prime minister. One of them is Eli Feldstein. The other is Yonatan Ulrich. We'll go back to Ulrich and explain just how important he is in Netanyahu's orbit. All this is happening while Netanyahu himself is testifying in his own trial, which is abruptly halted, and he needs to be questioned in the Qatar Gate affair. We should also mention that his lawyer and Yonatan Urich's lawyer is the same man, Amit Haddad. That's one of the reasons he had to abruptly be questioned. All this is happening while the investigation, the Qatar Gate investigation, is being conducted by the Shin Bet, Israel's internal security service, and Netanyahu, we shall remind our listeners, is trying to fire the head of Shin Bet, Ronen Bar. This is a move being frozen by the courts at this point. And as you said, Netanyahu is trying to appoint former head of Navy Eli Sharvit to become the replacement for Ronen Bar. And really, merely a few minutes after this is in the world, his own base is saying to him, you can't do that because he was one of the protesters against the government. Netanyahu knew this, by the way. And one of the weird things that happens when that blows up is that Lindsey Graham, prominent senator in the Republican Party, also writes a tweet against this same Eli Sharvit, a tweet which was quite possibly ordered from Jerusalem. I mean,
we don't have enough craziness of our own. We need to import American craziness in the form of a tweet from Lindsey Graham interfering in the internal considerations surrounding the appointment of the head of the Israeli Secret Service. So all in all, a totally normal day.
Exactly. And of course, this led to this scorching response by Netanyahu's office saying not only, by the way, Netanyahu himself also saying his advisors were held hostage, right, as there are still 59 Israelis actually held hostage in Gaza. But he's, as you said, saying that essentially the Secret Service is carrying out a coup by using arrest warrants. I mean, as you say, it took this Israeli craziness to a completely new level. And to me, what was really interesting, Matti, I wonder what you think of this. When Netanyahu uses the term deep state, and he has been using it more and more, it obviously, it's another American import. No tariff this time, but we are paying a price for it for sure. It is an American import. It was brought in, I think, mainly by Yair Netanyahu. But to me, it seems like, I don't know, do you think that it is catching on? Do Israelis sort of buy that kind of term when Netanyahu uses it?
Because I write from here in English, I'm often on that line where Israeli reality meets the American reality or Western reality. And I find that our reality is often very much misunderstood when we use very short terminology to describe things. For example, right wing. When Americans say right wing, they mean one thing. When we say right wing, we mean something else. Most of the policies of Netanyahu, if transferred to America, would be in the Democratic Party in terms of, legal abortion, gun control, gay rights. The package of views that he holds would not really sit well with Republicans, but we call him right wing because in Israel, right wing means your approach to the conflict with the Arab world and the broader Islamic world. If you have certain views on the judiciousness of a conciliatory posture toward the Arab world, then you are either right wing or left wing. It doesn't really have anything to do with what it means in the United States. And it's been interesting and kind of depressing to see over the past few years the importing of American terminology and American ideas into our own political discourse. And the term you mentioned is a really great example. Like deep state. First of all, I guess we should say the term has been imported into Hebrew without translation. So it hasn't been translated into Hebrew as Medina Amuka, or I guess it would be something like that. The English phrase deep state has been imported. So Netanyahu has been putting out these videos in which he accuses the Israeli judiciary and the police and the Shin Bet of being part of a deep state conspiracy aimed at bringing him down. He kind of portrays them as some kind of progressive power that's trying to bring down a right-wing prime minister. And I think that the term deep state is actually catching on, which is strange, as we were discussing before the podcast, because Israel is such a small country that we never had the idea of a deep state because everyone basically knows each other. Even the head of the Shin Bet, he's not this shadowy figure in the basement. He's a guy named Ronen. We kind of know where he lives. And the Israelis have never had that American feeling that the government is persecuting them, or that the federal government should be a reason for suspicion. We don't have a constitution that protects us from the government. So the country has always been quite small and very dependent on the institutions of government and on the security services to keep us safe. So people haven't had that suspicion of conspiracy in the government, which is very much part of the American DNA. And there's an attempt to import it into Israel, and we're seeing it happen. And deep state, the term deep state is really the symptom of it. when you hear that term, we understand that an American political script is being tried out on an Israeli audience that has never heard it before. The term fake news has also been imported here in English. So fake news is now a term in Hebrew. And it's all symptoms of a kind of bleed of political discourse across the globe, I think in large part because of social media. Once American political discourse was very distant from here, and we had our own political discourse, but now everyone's on Twitter and Facebook, and the same ideas are being tried out in different places. You have this attempt to convince Israelis that the Shin Bet, which most Israelis have always considered to be a pillar of our security, an organization that has tremendous power, tremendous undemocratic power, we should say. It's kind of something we put up with because we understand that we're threatened, and we can't always be completely a gentle or liberal in pursuit of our own security. And Israelis put up with that. And now we're being told that actually this organization is a danger to us because it's trying to bring down an undemocratic faction. A prime minister from the right, a prime minister who I guess we should say has appointed the heads of the Shin Bet over the past decade and a half. Netanyahu, as I wrote in the Free Press yesterday, has been in power since the first Avatar movie came out. He's been in power since 2009. So the idea that he is kind of a scrappy opposition to some kind of progressive state apparatus is a bit strange. The heads of the Shin Bet, who he himself appointed, people like Yoram Cohen or the police commissioner, Oni Al-Sheikh, both of them affiliated with the right. I'm not sure exactly what their politics are, but they're certainly not on the left. And they've also come out warning Israelis of an acute danger coming from Netanyahu here. So we're talking about an unprecedented clash between different bodies in the state apparatus in the middle of a war where Israelis are being woken up at night by ballistic missiles from Yemen, and there are signs that the reserve army is cracking under the strain of a year and a half of combat. People just can't do more than 300 days of reserve duty. And of course, the fighting in Gaza is continuing. And as you mentioned, we have 59 real hostages, dead and alive, still kept in Gaza. So we can't afford this kind of breakdown in our own government. And yet here we are.
I think as Israelis, we're kind of used to, ever since Netanyahu was indicted, and even a little bit before, maybe since his investigations began after 2015, for him pointing a finger at the judiciary or the courts, or, blaming him or saying, my case is fabricated, and the Ministry of Justice or the prosecution. But here, this is really playing with fire in the way that he is turning all of his firepower at the Shin Bet, the Internal Security Service, and saying that they are, as close to saying this is a coup against my government, to say nothing of the fact that last week he basically almost, well, not absentmindedly, but in the sort of din of the headlines, maybe we missed this, he kind of said that Ronen Bar himself knew about October 7th hours before it happened and didn't do anything, which is another accusation at a level that we aren't used to. Let's maybe talk about that danger. What happens when you turn the institution, such an important institution, into something that is, as you say, dangerous to Israelis?
I think this process has been going on for a couple of years, and you know this much better than I do. Throughout Netanyahu's own legal woes, he's been trying to portray the judiciary as a rival power center. And I remember having a discussion with Amir Ohana, who's the Speaker of Parliament, when he became Israel's first openly gay cabinet minister. I wrote a profile of him for the New York Times and was speaking to him about this. And I guess surprised to hear him describe the Supreme Court and the judicial apparatus, which Israelis have always just seen as part of, the state, as a rival power that is opposed to the government. And Netanyahu certainly sees it that way. So, we're all supposed to obey the law. We're supposed to pay our taxes. And yet we're being told that the judiciary is actually this malevolent actor, which, moves behind the scenes in an undemocratic way to bring down the democratically elected government of the state. Again, a prime minister who's been in power since 2009. I mean, he's been in power for more than a decade and a half with a very brief interruption. And this is it's a dangerous way to run any country, but certainly a country where you're demanding of your citizens incredible sacrifice. I mean, I have two sons who are finishing 12th grade. They have to go to the army next year, and we're in the middle of a war. And of course, they'll go. That's the law, and they're highly motivated, and they understand that it's necessary. But at the same time, you're telling me that the apparatus of which the military is a part is engaged in a coup against the prime minister of Israel, and that the Shin Bet, which has incredible power over the lives of Israeli citizens and over the lives of Palestinians who are not Israeli citizens, that this organization is capable of fabricating allegations in order to bring down the prime minister? And what are we supposed to think about that as people who come under the purview of the Shin Bet? What are Palestinians supposed to think about that? What is an international community, if such a thing exists? What are international observers, let's say, supposed to think about, our own claim that this war is being run judiciously by institutions that are rational and are, trying to win this war in a way that's as reasonable and painless as possible, if that's the right word. Netanyahu, our own prime minister, is saying something completely different. I mean, he's saying that these institutions are actually malevolent and deceitful. So, what exactly are we Israeli citizens and international observers supposed to think of all this? But maybe we should explain exactly what the Qatar Gate.
Yeah, maybe we should. I was hoping you do that.
Actually, I was hoping you would do that. It's funny because when two journalists speak, there's always a tension because each of us thinks that we're the interviewer. So, and I guess we should also say that Qatar Gate, which is, I guess, how it would be pronounced in English, rhymes with Watergate.
It does.
And that kind of gets lost in the Hebrew, but I think that's, of course, part of the pun.
If we needed to summarize Qatar Gate in a sentence, and of course there's a lot to say beyond that, but the suspicion is that Netanyahu's top advisors during wartime received money from Qatar. And this is alongside their work for the prime minister.
One thing that's become clear after October 7th is the scope of Qatari influence. And I think that not everyone understood that before, but the Qatar is a very small Gulf oil dictatorship that has been incredibly smart in the way they've applied their influence around the world. So you'll see Qatari money in NGOs, in think tanks, in universities in the West, in real estate projects. They show up, Qatari money shows up in the bank accounts of all kinds of people in all kinds of places, often on multiple sides of an issue. So if you notice, for example, that Qatar hosts the leadership of Hamas, then, which seems hostile to an Israeli or to someone sympathetic to Israel, you also have to notice that the Qataris have somehow come to host a crucial American military base that cannot be moved. And if you, if you notice that, Qatar funds and controls Al Jazeera, which is a really kind of poisonous propaganda channel with tremendous influence, then you also have to notice that somehow they became mediators for the release of Israeli hostages and that they've done business in the past with the hostage negotiator of the Trump administration. So we've all noticed that Qatari money, as I wrote in the Free Press, it's kind of like those fingerprints that show up when you turn on an ultraviolet light. Suddenly you see their fingerprints everywhere. But I think not many people suspected that the fingerprints would show up in Israel. So we've known for several years that the Qataris have been allowed under Netanyahu to transfer millions of dollars to Hamas in Gaza since 2018, basically as a way of buying quiet in Gaza, because the thinking was, and this wasn't just Netanyahu, that if Hamas is relatively happy and if there's economic stability in Gaza, then there will be quiet on the border. This was a terrible miscalculation, but it was an error made in good faith. People in the defense establishment thought it was an okay idea. In retrospect, it's hard to imagine how anybody thought that, but I don't think that's not corruption necessarily. That's a defensible error. However, the existence of Qatari money in the bank accounts of Netanyahu's aides is a matter of a completely different level. Qatar is a hostile state. It is the financial backer of Hamas and the country that hosts the leaders of Hamas. And the idea that Israeli officials are being paid by Qatar is, again, it's something very close to treason. Accepting money, if you're in a government position from any foreign power, even if it's an Israeli ally, would be tremendously controversial and problematic, because you can't pursue the interests of your own country if you have, if your bank account depends on some other country, clearly. So even if it were money from Canada or, Argentina, it would be tremendously problematic. And the allegation is that the two aides that you mentioned were being paid in different ways by Qatar. A few other people are in house arrest, including, we should say, the editor of the Jerusalem Post, which seems like a very extreme step. And we don't know exactly why he's under house arrest. Of course, the rest of a journalist is. It always raises, it kind of turns on that warning light. We don't know exactly what's going on there. And I hope that the police know what they're doing, because if it turns out that he was put under house arrest for reasons that are not completely solid, then that will also be a pretty major scandal. But we're talking about allegations that are of the most serious level. And I guess the last thing I'll say is that Netanyahu put out a video last night. He's been communicating with his public with these videos in which he introduced
pre-recorded and edited. It's never answering questions unless
right. It's not answering
14.
questions.
Yeah.
Correct. And he says that's where he's introduced the term deep state. That's where he's referred to his arrested aides as hostages, which for Israelis right now is a term of incredible potency, and to use that term in this context is quite is really something. But last night he put out another statement in which he tried to make the case that all of his political opponents also had contacts with Qatar. He accused the head of the Shin Bet of having contacts with Qatar. He completely ignored the heart of the allegation, which is that his aides were paid by Qatar. He just didn't say anything about it. And if you watch the statements just a few minutes, you'll notice that the only thing he doesn't say is that the allegations are wrong. So if this is the response, then I think we can assume that the allegations are true.
Yeah, and just to add to that, when the arrest of Yonatan Ulrich was made public on Monday, that is, Yonatan Ulrich is not just another Netanyahu advisor. He is the spin master. He is, I would go as far as saying almost a Dominic Cummings to Prime Minister Boris Johnson in the way that he is the, what Naftali Bennett called Netanyahu's poison machine. He meant that sort of apparatus that is unleashed against political rivals, whether it be a person or a company, that you want to sort of unleash this, either the politicians of the Likud that are at Netanyahu's behest or the bots on social media. The person who works on that apparatus is Yonatan Ulrich. There was actually this, a few analysts contemplating this week the idea that Yonatan Ulrich would turn a state's witness against Netanyahu, and that's what Netanyahu is worried about. I would say, if anyone knows what happens to someone who turns into state's witness against Netanyahu, people like Nir Chefetz or Shlomo Filber, which, by the way, not to complicate this further, if I remember correctly, but Yonatan Ulrich was indicted for harassing Shlomo Filber. If anyone knows what happens to the people when they turn state witness, it's Yonatan Ulrich himself. So that would be, I don't know if he would be the one to turn state's witness. He's a young guy, by the way. He's 36 years old. He was brought into Netanyahu's orbit by Netanyahu Jr., Yair Netanyahu, with whom he served in the IDF spokesperson's unit. This is not just, an advisor. This is a top advisor, one of the closest people to Benjamin Netanyahu, which explains...
It's Ben Rhodes. Ben Rhodes.
That's a good example. Maybe Ben Rhodes to Barack Obama. That's why Netanyahu's response was also at the volume that we saw this week, I think.
Yes, I think that's true. I mean, these are not people on the margins of the action in the world of the prime minister. These are his key people. And that is I think, why we're seeing the hysterical response that we're seeing from Netanyahu. This is very, very close. He's not going to be able just to cut these people loose and, avoid the damage. It's too close to him. And that's why we're seeing Netanyahu really take the ship of state into the Bermuda Triangle, basically. I mean, he's really willing to risk everything in order to keep this thing at bay. And I guess we should also say, just in the in the interest of caution, we don't really know, and we don't know all the details here. Mm-hmm. It's not 100% clear exactly, why all the people who are under arrest are under arrest. And of course, everyone is innocent until proven guilty. But the willingness of the prime minister to risk not just the cohesion of Israeli society, which he's already damaged to a degree that is unprecedented since the election of this most recent government in the fall of 22. But he's willing to risk Israel's international reputation in the middle of a war. He's willing to risk the faith that the public has in the entities of government. The price here is incredibly high. And I think that a more responsible leader, even if he were convinced of the justice of his cause and convinced that he's the greatest leader Israel's ever had and that his presence is necessary for the security of the state, a responsible leader would look at this and see his country breaking down around his own personality, which is what's happening. It's been happening for a few years, and would say, okay, I believe that I'm right, but the cost is unbearable. So I will now step back. I will point an heir, someone who shares my ideological leanings, and I will allow the state to heal. Which is just not going to happen as long as Netanyahu is in power. But he's such a tenacious politician. He's a politician of real genius, and his genius is to survive another week. That's the genius, and I'm not belittling that. That turns out to be quite a substantial form of political skill, and he's been doing it for more than a decade and a half, with that very short break when Bennett was in power. So, he's a politician with real talents, and he'll do anything to survive. And we're watching it happen right now.
And as we sit and talk, the war is in day 545, and not showing any signs of weakening. Actually, quite the opposite. Israel expanding the operations in Gaza, centering on Rafah. The defense minister, Israel Katz, actually talking about Israel taking extensive parts of Gaza for its security. The reports coming out of Gaza are talking about 68 Palestinians killed on Wednesday. It is very clear that Israel's government has decided to go back to war, what is really concerning for the people, for the hostages' families, and for the people who support them. And sadly, this has become this sort of two sides of a story instead of everyone being on the same side. Is that this means that no one is really talking about, bringing them back? There are these negotiations, but it doesn't seem like it's moving forward in any way.
That's right. I mean, I wish I could see something positive in response, but fighting has resumed in Gaza, and we're a year and a half almost into this war, and there's no conclusive resolution in sight, and it is excruciating for the families of hostages. And I think that here, it's important to remember that the side that not only started the war but is deciding to continue it is Hamas, and I think there's increasing awareness of that in Gaza, because another thing that we saw in the past week, really for the first time, the substantial protests conducted by Palestinians in Gaza against Hamas and against the continuation of the war. And I think things have become, so dire for many people in Gaza that they see themselves as having either no choice or nothing left to lose, because coming out against Hamas, of course, can be very perilous. And indeed, one of the leaders of the protest was murdered by Hamas as a warning. And another young Palestinian from Gaza was shot by a Hamas policeman, and his family then went and found the policeman and killed the policeman. All this has happened in the past week, and it's a sign of really an unprecedented breakdown in Hamas rule in Gaza. We haven't seen this kind of public dissent and in the Gaza Strip for a very long time. The signs of cracks in Palestinian society in Gaza are also very real, and I think that Israelis looking at this can see some reason for hope that there could be a resolution there. The war in Gaza has turned out to be much longer and much more complicated than I think anyone really expected. I mean, Netanyahu, a few months into the war, was talking about us being a step from victory. That's a term that he used several times more than a year ago. So these wars are very complicated, and I'm not sure that we're going to see a resolution that is really to anyone's satisfaction.
But we do know one thing. I don't know to say that we know it for sure, but we do know that Netanyahu, as you said, the political genius is to live for another week or even for another day. He bought himself a lot of time the minute the budget passed in the Knesset, quite easily, we should say, then at least on paper, unless someone decides to, blow this up from within the coalition, at least on paper, he has another year until the next budget is up. We should say that if the budget doesn't pass in the Knesset, then that automatically triggers elections. That's a long time. We do see a little bit of movement in the political arena the minute that Naftali Bennett officially registers a new political party, temporarily named originally Bennett 2026, that at least gives a sign that something is moving. And of course, Bennett is at this point the only real threat to Netanyahu. But again, as we said, he just bought himself more time.
That's right, and it's amazing, and also quite depressing to remember that part of the support that he now enjoys in Knesset comes from Benny Gantz's party. So votes that were cast for Benny Gantz in 2022, that is votes that were cast against the Netanyahu bloc, have been moved into the Netanyahu bloc in the form of the faction that's led by Gideon Sa'ar, who's now the foreign minister. Yep. So he's there's no politician in Israel that can match Netanyahu for political skill, and a lot of people admire that. I don't really. I don't think that that's leadership or vision. And just to watch these videos that have come out over the past week or so, where he speaks to the camera and talks about the deep state and kind of makes these jokes about the deep state wants the elected politicians to be like a potted plant, as passive as a potted plant. It's in Hebrew, and then the camera pans and shows a potted plant. I mean, just to think that Zionism starts with Theodor Herzl and continues with Weizmann and Ben Gurion and Menachem Begin and people like Yitzhak Rabin, and to see that this is the level of our leadership is nothing that any of us should be happy about, even if we have some admiration for political skill. Leadership is about more than political skill. And I think that if your deliberations are determined by what will buy you another week, you may be able to survive another week, but your country will be in terrible shape, because the decisions you will make in order to survive another week are not always the decisions that your country needs in the interest of its long-term health. And that's very much where we are. And I think that this is also the story of the Qatar business. And it's the story of seemingly the different allegations against Netanyahu that are now being investigated in court. Israelis would call this kombinot. I don't think Netanyahu is a traitor to Israel, and I don't think he was selling secrets to the Qataris or anything like that. And I don't think his aides were. I think it's just a style of leadership that that declares that you will decide what is legal, you will decide what is secret, you will decide who is an enemy and who is not an enemy. You will do whatever is necessary in order to make your own political machinations succeed. And we're really seeing a clash between that outlook, which is very personality centric, and an older outlook where it's about law or about institutions. And we're seeing it not just in Israel, of course, we're seeing it in America too, where there's an attempt to institute a leadership style that's very much about the personality. So you have a personality in charge, and that personality will decide on a given day what is in the national interest and what the law is and what it isn't. And when the law doesn't, the law says something that you don't like, then you just change it. And we're really seeing this style being tried in both of those countries, and they're both kind of inspiring each other and clashing with each other in ways that are, I think, very dangerous to the fabric of the state. And I'm not saying that as someone who's naive about the liberal order. I think there are many problems with it, and it's possible here that there is overreach on the part of the state or the judicial system. The alternative is this kind of leadership where the whims of the great man in charge on a given day will dictate what is and is not legal and what is and is not patriotic. I mean, if any left-wing or centrist prime minister were accused of having aides paid by the government of Qatar, the earth would shake in Israel. Netanyahu, were he in opposition now, Netanyahu would be screaming into microphones about treason in the prime minister's office. And the fact that it's happening with Netanyahu in charge allows him to say, as he did last night, well, Qatar is not really an enemy state. He said that. That's more or less a direct quote from this video last night. He's not denying the allegations. He's just saying that he will decide if Qatar is an enemy state. He will decide what's legal, and these kind of small machinations where it's okay to accept gifts from friends, as he told the court in one of the corruption trials. Okay, so if that's okay, then can you accept a gift from a foreign government? Can you allow your defense spokesman to be paid by the government of Qatar through an American middleman, which seems to be true, which no one is denying? So it's a slippery slope that starts with this idea that you will decide, the great man in charge will decide what is legal and what isn't. And it starts with, bottles of champagne or, small examples of, cutting corners. And it ends with a full-blown national security crisis, which is what we're in right now.
Yeah. And to add to that, I think the layer of tragedy is the fact that ever since October 7th, this has all been moved into overdrive because of the fact that he is trying to somehow convince the public that he has absolutely no responsibility over what happened, right? It is all the defense establishment. It is all Ronen Bar's fault, head of Shin Bet, and it is all Herzi Halevi's fault, former head of the chief of staff of the IDF. And he had, if only they woke him up, but they didn't. And nothing is, the fact that he doesn't take responsibility, I think catapults this into a situation where you need to have so much blame to throw at everyone else just to kind of save yourself in this situation. So it really exacerbates everything that we have been talking about. The fact that he's also trying to, as we speak, also trying to escape the public's demand for him to take responsibility, to set up a commission of inquiry, which he refuses to do.
When I look around, everything you said is completely correct. And you look around in Israel and you meet the most amazing people. So you walk up the street and you just see amazing people are doing amazing things, and people are incredibly creative, and you go into the high-tech world and you see just a level of creativity that is quite astonishing in people running their startups and serving in the reserves. And if you have any contact with the reserve army, you see an unbelievably committed public that no other Western country can boast anything close to what Israel has in terms of the creativity of the people who live here and the commitment of the people who live here to the state. And then you look at the political level of the country, and it's almost not the same country. I mean, the refusal to take responsibility for what is clearly one of the great failings in the history of the state of Israel is really astonishing. And probably of all of the acts of this last Netanyahu government, not just since October 7th, but since the fall of 22, when he appoints Itamar Ben-Gvir to be in charge of the police and all kinds of warning lights begin to go off, probably nothing is as disturbing as a refusal to allow a state inquiry into what happened on October 7th. And yet here we are. I mean, there has been no state inquiry. As far as I can tell, the most careful and detailed description of what happened on October 7th was just published by the British government, which is a real mark of shame for Israel, which again has people who could have written something much better. And if you're looking for a reason for optimism, I mean, in a weird
that's what I was going to end with. Give me something, Matti.
In a week, yeah. I'm not sure if this is exactly going to qualify, but there was a poll over the weekend where people were asked, "Do you trust the government?" And the numbers were quite shocking. And again, polls, you have to take them with a grain of salt and, with all of the necessary caveats. But 70% of Israelis said that they don't trust the government. And this isn't the government of, the state government in Wisconsin. It's not the government of Canada. This is a government in the middle of a war that is taking our sons and daughters and relatives and sending people into battle. 70%, that's more than 2/3 of Israelis, do not trust the people who are doing that, which is quite an astonishing figure. Only 26% said they trusted the government, and perhaps even more striking is that only 51% of coalition voters said they trust the government. So people who voted for the current government, just about half said that they trust the government, and more than a third, 36%, said they don't. So, amid all of this, and I'm trying to spin this as a sign
I'm really waiting, my friend.
Of public health, of the sanity of the Israeli public. I think, despite the spin and despite everything, most people here seem to realize that something very bad has gone wrong, and that's not going to translate this week into a different political leadership. But it does show that people across the spectrum, including people who are on the right, and much of the criticism of Netanyahu from inside the intelligence world has come from people on the right. And if you look at the electorate, people understand that it really can't continue in this way. We can't run a war that's demanding incredible sacrifice of Israelis if the prime minister thinks the Shin Bet is trying to conduct a coup. You can't run a war in which people are being not asked, but ordered to do 250 days, 300 days of reserve duty to be away from their families and their businesses and maybe die at the same time as Netanyahu is trying to enshrine in law a draft exemption for his ultra-Orthodox voters on whom his coalition depends. They refuse to serve in the army, and the government is trying to allow them that right. So there's a lot of unhappiness in the Israeli public right now, and I realize this is a strange way to kind of reach for optimism, but because I think unhappiness is justified and I see the unhappiness, then I do think that the Israeli public realizes that something very serious has gone wrong here, and that gives me hope that we'll be able to pull ourselves out of it.
See, you managed to do it in the end. Just sprinkle a little bit of optimism.
This is it's a bit of a reach to say, wow, let's be optimistic, but the fact that everyone realizes how bad things are. But that's where we are this week, Unique. What can I do?
The first stage of fixing it is to know what the problem is.
Wait, what are you optimistic about?
I mean, this is a week in which we heard, Yarden Bibas talk to 60 Minutes, and Keith Siegel, and Elia Cohen, and Amit Sosana, who received a prestigious award in Washington. And you see these amazing, courageous Israelis who have been through hell and back and are telling their story and are still fighting for their friends in captivity. The more we see these kinds of people in our political sphere, in our leadership, I think that will give us a lot of I'm sorry if it sounds like a terrible cliche, but I think it's a cliche for a reason. I think that is the more we see that, and I think we will, I think that is the way to begin to fix things. So that's my optimism. Matti, thank you so much for talking to me in this incredibly busy week of yours. Next time we'll talk about your favorite color. I'm kidding.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure.
The present is clearly giving us a headache, so let's escape thousands of years into the past. This is a conversation Jonathan and I had with the author of a fascinating new book about Abraham that illuminates so much of the questions we're actually asking ourselves to this day.
Anthony Julius is a distinguished lawyer, scholar and writer, and Sir Stephen Fry says he is the cleverest man I've ever met. He came to prominence as the divorce lawyer of Princess Diana, as the lawyer who battled and defeated the Holocaust denier David Irving, and he's written on T.S. Eliot, a definitive study of English anti-Semitism, and a whole lot else. His latest book is Abraham, the First Jew. Anthony Julius, welcome to Unholy.
Thank you very much for having me. I listen to this show. I'm delighted to be on it.
Well, we are very delighted to have you. So Abraham, a huge subject who has sort of inspired, writers over centuries and centuries. I want to sort of combine two things, which is firstly, for you to tell us why this was a compelling subject for you to turn to now, but also because I think it's the premise in a way for everything else that follows. This very particular approach you've taken in this book, which is to say there are two Abrahams, Abraham 1 and Abraham 2, for you to explain that as a sort of to set the table for the rest of our conversation.
So I first came across the Abraham story when I was 8. I read it in a strip cartoon version of the Bible. I had no difficulty getting through the creation stories. The flood left me unmoved, but I could not get beyond the binding of Isaac. Why? Because of the utter betrayal of the son by the father. That God's own behavior didn't concern me, but that a father could behave in the way that Abraham did towards his son was something I could not reconcile myself to. And in fact, I gave up the book at that point. The rest of the stories in the Bible remained dark to me until much later on. The reason that I came back to the Abraham story when I was so much older is because I'd never forgotten about it, and that early experience of reading about the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, obviously marked me. But it gave me a chance to write about what I think is a constitutive division in the kind of the Jewish psyche, if I can speak in that shorthand, which is between, on the one hand, a very strong imperative to challenge, to criticize, and a similarly strong imperative to find modes of collective expression, identification with the Jewish people as a whole. Religious times would be simply regarded as matters of faith, and which in our own times would be broadened to all matters of collective identification with the Jewish people. Abraham lived those two imperatives in the first part of his life as a resistor of the polytheism of his society, and then in the second part of his life as God's friend, a man who subordinated himself to God's will.
You call Abraham 1, you said he's committed to a life of inquiry, and then Abraham 2 is committed to a life of service. And at some point in the book, it's a beautiful book, and you talk about how we are both of them. Every Jewish life is two lives.
Yes.
I want to talk a little bit about that, of each of us having both of those Abrahams in them.
Yes, we do, and it's not a comfortable form of coexistence. I don't think there's some point of equilibrium in which we can, so to speak, pull off the trick of reconciling the two. I think that we live in this unstable condition of self-interrogation, inquiry, challenge, subversive thinking, taking the argument where it leads us without regard to loyalties, collective fidelities, all the rest of it, the kind of the maverick Jew. And we lead our lives with a strong sense of identification with the Jewish nation, the Jewish people. We have a sense of belonging to a larger group. When we hear the shofar blown in shul, we have a strong sense that other Jews in many other places are hearing the shofar at the same time, and that we're bound together in some entity which is real and much larger than us. Now, that's why when Jews exercise the first imperative, they're often regarded as traitors, or worse than traitors, by people for whom the second imperative sounds loudest. And it's a source of tremendous unhappiness and disharmony in the Jewish world. But there it is. This is what we have to live with.
I'm wondering, just now listening to you, I hadn't thought of this before, but whether or not that maps at all onto the other dichotomy there is in the Jewish story, which is between the particular and the universal. Is the critical reasoning part somehow, can you map that onto the universal impulse that there is in Jews to think about humanity in the world, and the life of service impulse, Abraham 2 impulse, is that kind of more particularist, narrow one? Or is that just another dichotomy? Because one of the points you make in the book is that we are very, very prone to this as a people, to think in binaries and
dichotomies. Yeah, we are a dichotomous people. And I rather than mapping the dichotomies on top of each other, which is another kind of drive towards reconciliation, and I'm highly suspicious of all forms of reconciliation. I think that we should live in the problems and not seek the answers. I thought you were going in another direction. I thought you were saying that the universal was the collective and the particular was the individual. You see, you can run the argument in one direction or the other. You can't escape the argument.
I am wondering about, obviously, the core of the Abraham story, which is Ha'akedah. As you said, you were fixated on this, on him binding Isaac and being ready to kill him. So one thing is to ask if after writing this you have a better understanding. And the other is that I've found it really interesting, your description of how the family essentially fell apart after this. I mean, that there was no way to rectify the relationship with his son, no way to rectify the relationship with his wife, and that essentially he, it's a sad ending for this first Jew. I mean, you say he's a father who wrecks his children's lives, of course, the child also being Ishmael. You call him homeless and godless at the end. God stops talking to him directly after the Akedah. I'm going on and on, but essentially it's to ask if you feel like you understand this story better.
Well, there is that great observation of, I think it's Kleist actually, who said that, ask me what I think, I'll tell you what I think when I tell you what I think. I don't know what I think until I explain what it is that I think. We all have that experience. We go to a movie, we leave the show, and someone says, what did you think of it? And it's only when we say what we thought of it that we know what we thought of it. And that's true for me. It certainly was true for me in writing this book. I had a kind of inchoate sense of what I understood by the Akedah, but it was only in writing the book out that I actually knew what I thought. I found that generally, and in a way that's what drives me to write in the first place, because I'd like to know my own mind. So what do I think now? I think that the life is a desperate life. I think Abraham ends his life in a condition of general alienation. He's lost his wife. He no longer speaks to his son Isaac. He no longer is in contact with his son Ishmael. He sends the children of his final marriage off to parts unknown, and he has no further contact with the Almighty. I mean, it's extraordinary to me that notwithstanding these aspects of his life, which are fully attested to in the Torah, that there is a general Jewish understanding of Abraham as having lived a life which is something, so to speak, one only wishes to celebrate. The instinct, the drive to find consolation in our scriptures is so strong, it rides over the scriptures themselves. It's most unusual. There's a kind of turning away from the text in the wish for what is called banally positivity or uplift or good cheer. Makes no sense to me.
In fact, you make this point, don't you, that there are many, many readings of the Torah that are legitimate, but some are just not. And the one you put in that category is the sort of sugary, soft focus view that this is a test and all works out well in the end, that that his son is saved, it's all fine. And you say that I'm not even allowing that as a kind of legitimate reading. But you go through, I want to say something just about how you tell it. It is absolutely gripping, your account of the Haggadah. I don't want people to hear this and think it's some kind of academic disquisition. You tell the story, and the reader is sort of, I found myself sort of digging my nails into the chair. There's suspense and it's gripping, and that makes the episode all the more painful as you're reading it. And then you go into, back in sort of scholar mode, you go into the different possible readings. But I'm with Yonit on this. You give us the 6 possible readings, but at the end of it, I'm thinking, you've given us 1,000 different answers, but maybe still no real answer, because it is still such a mystery. And so even though you've set out all the ways you might interpret it, does it not remain a bit of a black hole in our, foundational text, this absolutely horrific episode?
Yes. Yeah, yes. So I'm with the rabbi, in the joke where he decides in favor of one party and then the adversary party, and his students say to him, "How can you say he's right and he's right?" To which the rabbi says, "Yes, you're right." So I think I think the plurality of interpretations is both, so to speak, a fact of complicated texts like the Haggadah, but it also points to something which is more profound, and that is that there is no resolution of the Haggadah. There is no, so to speak, meaning of it, which allows us to move on from it. We're stuck in it.
I want to talk about the character of Sarah. You say that she may have been a greater prophet. You talk about her intellectual independence and her autonomy. Let's talk about her a little bit.
I'm very glad that you raised this, because it's the part of the book that I spent really most time thinking about. It's extraordinary to me that just as the Haggadah has given a pat resolution in received Jewish thinking, Sarah herself is written out of received Jewish thinking, other than as a kind of helpmeet and a supporter of the patriarch. If you actually look at the trajectory of Sarah's life, even as related in the Torah itself, without going to any midrashic, supplemental or elaborative material, what you see is a radical decline, a kind of collapse, both in her own morale and in the nature of her marriage to Abraham. She begins in Haran, fully the equal of Abraham, engaged in the same kind of conversionist activity as her husband. She's then mistreated by Abraham in episodes, both with Egypt's Pharaoh and with the local king Abimelech, where she has to pass as Abraham's sister so he can be safe and then enrich himself. And yet, when she presses on Abraham her wishes in relation to Hagar, and Abraham resists it, he has a vision of God telling him that he should pay attention to Sarah and follow her wishes because she is the superior prophet. So how to make sense of this story, how to do it justice, how to give, so to speak, Sarah a voice, that felt to me a really important obligation of anyone attempting to give an account of Abraham's own life. So much so that when I was thinking about the form of the book, were it not that my mandate was to write a biography of Abraham, I would rather have written a collective biography of the two of them. And I had in my mind those great 19th century novels of the collapse of marriages, in which the principal character is not the husband, who is often a bit of a schlemiel. Think of Anna Karenina or Madame Bovary, but the wife. The focus of attention is on her. So I wanted to so to speak, have the Anna Karenina principle, which is my favorite novel, my favorite book. as exercising a kind of magnetic or gravitational pull that the Abraham narrative had to respond to. And I hope that it registers in the final version of the book that is published.
No, it completely does. She looms very large in the story. And also it goes to this point about him being, I mean, you said Shlemiel, but he being an extraordinarily unsympathetic character as a character. And that's an interesting thing to confront, that the first Jew is this kind of monomaniac fanatic ready to do terrible things. But even if you put the Akedah to one side, everything else, but because you meant everything else he does is pretty unsympathetic. And I'd be interested to know what you think about what that does for the Jewish people, that the founding patriarch is actually this very flawed figure. But just on, because you mentioned form, I mean, biographers usually can rely on contemporaneous documents. There are letters, there are diaries. You don't have any of that if you're writing about Abraham. And a lot of people will think, well, so surely all you've got is the Torah, and that's for a biography, it's difficult. And yet when you're reading it, you've got way more than that. You've got color, you've got description. There's one moment where you have Abraham thought but didn't say, and then you give us a whole paragraph. And, of course, I'm then thinking, well, what's your source for that? Is it fair to call this a kind of, and you've mentioned Anna Karenina and Madame Bovary's influences, is it fair to call this a novelistic biography?
Yes, I mean, call it novelistic. I would wear that title as a costume of honor. Call it novelistic, call it imaginative, call it midrashic. The rabbinical midrashic material also shares, I mean, somewhat anachronistically in the history of the novel, but somewhat shares in novelistic properties and practices. I didn't set out to write an account of the kind that might be subtitled The Search for the Historical Abraham. That seemed to me an idle enterprise. I'm not an archaeologist. It's not something that interests me as an undertaking. What I wanted to write about was about the figure of Abraham in the Jewish imagination. And of course, there he has such a compelling reality that the rest of us mere empirical Jews fade in comparison.
But I do want to pick on a thread that Jonathan just asked, which is, what does it mean about us? What does it mean about Judaism that our patriarch, that the first Jew, is so terribly flawed and ends his life the way that Abraham does?
I wouldn't want anyone to think that I wrote one of those tedious look at
No, it really isn't.
and his clay feet kind of let me expose the flawed man behind the kind of the prophetic image. It's my purpose is not reductive. In a way, I think it's celebratory for two reasons. First of all, what I try to elicit in Abraham's life, and certainly in the early part of it, is a tremendously compelling and courageous readiness to challenge, at great personal cost, every received view that is held in his society for no purpose other than, but it's everything, the purpose of the truth. And that I think alone would make any people proud to have such a founding father. Mm-hmm. The second reason is that Abraham leads a life which has an exemplary significance for us in precisely that division between reason and faith, speculative inquiry and service, that so to speak, the study in the synagogue. He defines the rules of the game that we play as Jews. In that sense, the detail of his life is less important than the structure of his life.
Although I found that the way the journey, the narrative arc, is sort of the reverse of what would be a more, to my very contemporary, perhaps, taste. You would almost imagine it be he's this person of service and devotion, and then becomes this more thinking, critical figure, more independent-minded. It's the other way around. Abraham 1 is the person you might expect to blossom out of Abraham 2, but it's the other way around. So that's quite, that I think adds to that sense of him being a sort of jarring figure to admire. There's so much to say about this. I'm aware that you have and write and think about contemporary issues and the bigger canvas that we're confronting now. And I know one of them is, and it relates to everything we've just talked about, is the state of our Jewish world, several millennia on from Abraham. And particularly, you, I think, wrestle like everyone else does with where we are with the relationship between Israel and diaspora, where Israel stands among the nations, perhaps particularly after the 7th of October. I'm deliberately keeping it very big and very vague because I want to sort of just hear how you come at these current questions.
Well, I suppose, like everyone else, I'm tortured and divided, distressed and anxious. And whenever I try to formulate my thinking, it either sounds hedged about with so many qualifications as to be useless to my interlocutors, or else just so distressed that it feels almost embarrassing to show it in public. But if I try to give the most general of overviews of where I am, and it's no more than where I am, and it has no greater value, I think, other than as the statement by one Jew to other Jews of his perspective. Where I am is all those intimate tensions between Israel and the diaspora, between the Zionist enterprise and one's kind of liberal political identity, the nature of one's specific Jewish affiliation in religious or sectarian terms, all of those, the sense of peril that we might have had in a very understated way as Jews in the diaspora, the sense of security that we might have had in relation to Jews in the state of Israel, all of those manageable tensions that form the kind of substance of our Jewish life have become radicalized. Everything is so much more extreme than it was. And do we just hope that there will be, so to speak, some kind of reversion to more intimate relations between those various dichotomies and tensions? Or do we find that actually where we're living now is in this life of extremism, where we loathe and despise what the government of Israel represents on the one hand, and we fear with an identification which is totally personal and visceral for the lives and the futures of our fellow Jews in Israel. How do we navigate that chasm between the contempt and the utter empathy? That's just one example of the extreme circumstances in which we find ourselves. I didn't think that I would be articulating it in that way. If you had asked me before the 7th of October, I didn't think I would be articulating it in that way or anything like that way. I feel absolutely divided, right down to my Jewish core, and it's painful even to express it.
We're not going to go back into the Abraham book, but you have this one reading of the Akedah story, which is about the patch up. And it's the business of the ram that's found in the thicket, and Abraham decides to sacrifice that instead. And it's sort of to try and patch up what's happened. And you say that this is, first of all, you say it's a habit that we sometimes do this. We try and come to find some place where we can reconcile irreconcilable things. And you say, and sometimes it's good enough. And I mean that with the highest praise. That, in other words, if you sometimes can find an equilibrium that you can live with, that's no small thing. Don't disparage that. And I'm just wondering if that, in a way, relates to what you just, your answer there to your need. I mean, inevitably, this whole subject leads us to, because in terms of how diaspora are experiencing these things, the question of anti-Semitism, and that has been a big part of your working life. I mentioned your role in the trial Penguin Books and Deborah Lipstadt and David Irving, Holocaust denier. That was a quarter of a century ago. I remember at the time, I covered the trial, we talked about it a bit at the time, it felt as if it was the ending of something, the closing of a book in a way, after the Holocaust. I now have myself think about it very differently as a warning of a world where there's fake news and post-truth and denial and deep fake AI. And he was an early adopter of doctoring the evidence and so on. But even putting that point to one side, just in terms of anti-Semitism, is your sense that, or rather even more personally, are you more troubled by anti-Semitism in the world now than you were 25 years ago when you were in a London courtroom doing battle with somebody accused or rightly found to have denied the Holocaust?
It's perfectly true that at the time, anti-Semitism, certainly in the kind of Western European understanding of it, was a very boundaried affair. And where if it was to be fought out in public, it would be fought out subject to the heavy policing and the confining rules of legal proceedings. Whereas now one has a sense of a fully incontinent anti-Semitism, which strikes at random and strikes lethally anywhere. So in that sense, things are, in that very abstract way, just in terms of peril, things are only worse. I would really hate it. I mean, one can't write one's own obituary, but I would really hate to think that it was said of me that he spends a large part of his time addressing anti-Semitism, because a more worthless and absurd and contemptible a subject one couldn't possibly hope to imagine. So to commit one's life, or one's thinking life in particular, to that subject seems like a gigantic waste of time. I mean, part of the reason why I wrote the Abraham book is because I so strongly think that anti-Semitism has absolutely nothing to do with one's Jewish identity. It may be to do with the toxic foreign relations of the Jewish people with the not-Jewish world, but it's got nothing to do with what it is to be a Jew. So I'm constantly kind of correcting the lurching towards dealing with anti-Semites by asking questions about my own strong sense of my Jewish character, and then doing other stuff too. I wouldn't want that. I wouldn't want that as an epitaph. You know, he spent time being objectionable to objectionable anti-Semites.
I partly mention it because I think it's just behind there is a 1,000-page is also history of English anti-Semitism. It's been a big part of your working life. I mean, I get that you don't want that to be the epitaph, and don't worry, I don't think it will be, but it's been a big part of your working life necessarily, you could say.
Well, so there's this great story about Saul Lieberman, the great Talmudist, welcoming Gershom Scholem, the Kabbalist, to a public lecture, and Kabbalah and Scholem's endeavor was everything that Lieberman was most antagonistic to as a kind of mid-Nagdic rationalist Jew. So how was he going to meet the imperatives of courtesy between academics and at the same time keep faith with his antagonism? And he resolved it this way. He addressed his audience by praising Scholem indirectly, but also condemning him, and said, while it's true that rubbish is rubbish, the study of rubbish can be scholarship. So I mean, you know, lahavdil, as we say, but I do think that the study of anti-Semitism can be scholarship, and that's the kind of cold comfort I take from, as you so graciously point out, my 1,000-page complaint that I'm spending any time at all.
Too much time.
Yes.
But if we're writing the complaint for a while, just a little longer, I mean, the fact that you're chairing a new group tackling campus anti-Semitism. Yes. Could you give us your view on what went wrong there? I think it's a very general question, but what happened to academia in the West?
Well, it's a tough question because it really does require quite a substantial answer. And the elements in the answer, I suppose, would be a certain kind of post-collapse of communism orphaned progressivism, which has to find in discrete, specific causes an optimistic view of the world that can survive the disappointments of the larger project and the collapse of the larger progressive project. So that's part of it. There's the kind of valorizing of third world struggles, a certain sense that colonization, decolonization, and so on, these 19th century terms can be reactivated, can be revived in a way which gives some purpose to political activity. And also, of course, the fact that Jew hatred provides the solution to the otherwise intractable. I mean, if I can go back to just what I was talking about in Abraham, I think there is a moral integrity in privileging questions and puzzles over answers and solutions to puzzles. And that moral integrity only becomes obvious when you consider precisely the career of anti-Semitism, which proposes itself as the solution to every question and the answer to every puzzle. The French proto-fascist, anti-Semite, Charles Maurras, the leader of the Action Française at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, said, everything about modernity is difficult and impossible to understand until one discovers the role of the Jews, and then everything becomes clear. The problem with campus anti-Semitism is that it is adopted by people who wish everything to be clear. When it isn't.
I'm hesitant to hear just because it's in the realm of solution, but rather than living with the problem. But on Israel, you tell me if you balk at this description. I would, from knowing you and your work, I would could describe you as a liberal Zionist. I think an advocate, believer in the two-state solution, hesitance around the word solution, but that broadly being your position. Many now I encounter believe that is a sort of a relic. It is now a defunct position because it's no longer, they say, realistic, and therefore it is somehow nostalgic or sentimental to even hold on to it. You've got to rethink, adapt to the new world, etc., to the new reality, partly post-October 7th, but also other things too. Do you find yourself still holding that position yourself in terms of in your own mind, but also in terms of advocating it? What do you say to those people who say, sorry, Anthony, that moment has passed, you better have something, come up with something else?
Well, I don't feel that it's for me to devise solutions in the way that you might offer to somebody coming into a shop. If this doesn't fit you, try this, or have you considered the three-piece suit rather than a jacket and trousers and so on? If I go back to my own childhood in my father's menswear shops, I don't regard political advocacy in that way. I think a commitment to two states is an ethical commitment. In political terms, it may be that it is just about what John Rawls, the political philosopher, called a realistic utopianism. That's to say, one could just about imagine how it would work. But as an ethical position from which to make judgments about what is happening now and what so-called solutions, coerced outcomes is a better phrase, are actually being canvassed, it feels to me the only position to take.
Wouldn't it be nice if we could just solve everything in a menswear store?
Well, sometimes the customer's left without any clothes, wearing clothes, but not having bought clothes.
Or paying a very large bill. Anthony Julius, it was a pleasure talking to you. Long overdue on Unholy. We're very glad that we had an opportunity to do it finally.
Thank you for inviting me.
Not looking for solutions, but actually analyzing the problems is probably an accurate description of what we were trying to do today. A huge thank you to Anthony Julius for this conversation. Also a big thank you to Michal Porat. Jonathan will be back next week. Have a good weekend, everyone.